Glenn served as a Minnesota State Senator from 1981 to 1990. He was the Senate Minority Leader and had a successful political career. I asked Glenn how he became involved with politics and the steps he took to campaign for office.
How he got involved was literally through the Minnesota JCs, which is a Junior Chamber of Commerce. And back in the day, you just didn't automatically join the local Chamber of Commerce. If you were under the age of 30, you joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce or the JCs. And Glenn and some of his fellow people, workers, other employers in town joined the JCs. And this chapter in Mankato grew to probably the fourth largest in the country, and Glenn was the chair of that. And so not only was he growing his business at Taylor Corporation during the 80s, he was also very involved and engaged in the community. And so how he got involved, which happens a lot of times in politics, people look around saying, well, geez, the Senate seat is opening, it's redistricted. Why don't we go ask Glenn Taylor? He's done such a great job being part of the JCs, if he would be interested in running for the Senate. So it's not only just asking someone, it was literally a group of his friends recruiting Glenn to say, look at what you've done with the JCs, look what you've done with your business, how about joining and running for the Minnesota State Senate? And that's how he got involved. It was the community, civic-minded person that he was, to say, hey, I need to give something back.
From various times, people from the community came to me and said, we're having problems with this organization, would you take over? And if you look at my record, you see that I was involved in a lot of different organizations, but it was generally because there was a problem and I was asked to come in to straighten out the finances, usually the finances, sometimes the leadership. And I've received a phone call from a fellow JC that I knew very well and said, there's about 5 of us that are going to come over and visit with you. I didn't know what the visit was going to be about. They didn't explain it, but I assumed it was another community organization. But it surprised me when they said, there's an opening for running for a state senator, and we would like you to consider that. And it was like, state senator? What do I know about that? I know absolutely nothing. I had never been to a caucus meeting, any type of organization meeting by either party ever in my life. I did vote. That was my participation in the election process. But they talked about that. They said that we think we needed somebody who would be a leader to represent us in the Senate, and you have a history of being a leader.
Glenn was trying to figure out if he was a Republican or a Democrat, because in the 80s it wasn't as partisan as it is today, but he was a business person, but he really had a lot of concern about the community and certain things in the community, such as education. And so when Glenn decided to say, okay, I'm going to run, and he said, what do I run as? They said, well, they already have a Democrat, why don't you run as a Republican? He decided to do that. Then there was a process of getting endorsed. Well, the party did not endorse him. But all that meant is he could go to a primary, which is legally binding, and he decided to run in the primary as a Republican for the state Senate. And to do that, it was old-fashioned door knocking, going door to door, which he did. And that's where I'm sure he wore out his number of pair of shoes. But it wasn't always just in the city of Mankato. He represented, Blue Earth County and part of Nicollet County. And so he had to go farm to farm. And growing up on a farm, in that area, he certainly knew how to talk to the farmers as well as to the people in the city. And that's what it was. It wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't TV ads or radio ads, or it certainly wasn't social media. But what it was face-to-face, door-to-door, visiting with people.
Did some things that were really different than what people expected of me. Number one, I didn't put a single dollar of my own money into it. I said the only way I'll do it is if other people think that I should run and they can contribute to my campaign. And I did take that money. And I made the decision to knock on every door in the district. And however doors there are in this district, I knocked on every one, the rural ones and the towns, and and everyone. And that surprised people that I was a business guy, and yet I was willing to come to their house and ask them for their vote. So when it came to the election, I won quite easily and got myself elected. So I started in the rural, and I would go find out somebody in the rural, go to their home and that. And once I convinced them to support me, which I almost always did, I asked them if they would take me to 10 neighbors. So I went to 10 neighbors. I didn't have to walk up to the doors, you know, like blindly. I let another neighbor farmer take me up there and introduce me. And I found out that the farmers did most of the talking. I didn't have to do a lot of the talking. They talked for me. Then when I did the smaller communities, let's say Lake Crystal and Vernon Center and Mapleton and stuff like this here, the way I did that is I had every street, every house on a map. And I would say, I'm going to go to Lake Crystal and I'm going to do 25 houses. So I'd start down the street and get 25 houses, knock on the doors and stuff like that. Then I'd get in my car and I'd go to the next town and do 25. And I'd do the next one. So I'd get either 50 or 75 houses done in a day that I would knock on. And the reason I did that is that it came out in the papers that Glenn Taylor was in our community today knocking on doors. Next week, it would be in the paper again, Glenn Taylor was back knocking on doors. Of course, they were different 75 houses, but I did that in the smaller towns. And of course, I did the same thing in Mankato. I would do West Mankato, and then I would skip over to another part of Mankato, and then I'd go to North Mankato, hit three areas like that. So it made it sound like I was out even more often than I actually was. I would come up to the door and knock on the door, and either nobody was home, and if they weren't home, I had my mother write out notes. And every day she would write out about 40 notes and say, sorry I missed you, I called on you, appreciate your vote. So my mom wrote, I don't know how many thousands of notes, and I'd put that on the door. If they were there, they would always surprise of who, Glenn Taylor, what are you here for? You know, they kind of say something like that. I said, well, I'm running for the state senator. I'm just here to ask you for your vote. I tried to make the conversation as short as possible because I was trying to get 75 houses done and this type of stuff. And usually that's about it. They would just say, well, thanks for calling on me, and I leave. But occasionally you ran into people who really had an issue or a concern or something like this here. So sometimes you fell behind, but you always found out you never walked away from somebody, no matter how much they wanted to talk. And I think that helped me in the election, because I think what I heard most is Glenn was always a good listener. Not that I always voted with them exactly what they wanted to vote, but I was always a good listener. I did allow 1 day a week of not doing anything, and that was because if it rained, then I knew I wouldn't do something, so I didn't get behind. If it didn't rain, I caught up and got ahead, and type of thing. But it worked out about 2 weeks before the election. I had covered every house.
Glenn's business skills, his ability to negotiate and solve problems, and his leadership skills would help him as a new senator. He would be asked early on to build a team and structure that would help the Republican Party in Minnesota to become more effective.
I had never been to St. Paul, never had been to the Capitol, didn't know that you got paid to be a state senator, never looked into that and stuff like that. So in those things, I was quite naive. When I went up there, since I hadn't been involved in politics, I made my mind up that I'd keep my mouth shut and be really a good listener. So I got on the committees that I asked for, which was education and was mostly education. I decided I wouldn't be on the business committee because that would be too much self-interest. So I was on higher education, elementary education, every education committee I got onto, and committees like that.
I met Glenn in the summer of 1980. I worked for Al Quie. Glenn was running for his first term as a state senator, and Governor Quie introduced the two of us. Told me afterwards, this guy is a winner. He's going to be here. We need to know him. And lo and behold, Governor Quie was a good prophet. It certainly came to pass, and Glenn spent a terrific decade in politics as the leader that Governor Quie expected him to be.
Nobody really knew what business empire he really had, even in the early 80s. His presence was more known as a local state senator. And I remember when I first met him, and in his office over in Carlson Craft, it might have been an office 8 by 10 feet. The paneling wasn't paneling, it was the cork board, and he had post-it, or not when he posted notes, your notes with stick pins all over the place. And he had talked about being in the state senate and thinking of someday running for higher office. And I sat across from him and I said, well, geez, we'll have to tie your tie a little bit better, make sure that you're spiffed up a little bit. But very humble, always very humble, very respectful, and very friendly.
The unusual thing that happened to me is when I was elected, the leader of the Senate was a man, Senator Bob Ashbach. And Bob met me the first week I was elected and came into my office, and he says, I got a job for you. He says, I'm the only businessman in the Republican Party that's up here, and I could use somebody to help me. So I want you to be kind of like the secretary or the person that comes to every meeting and take notes and has ideas from the meetings. And what he meant by these meetings was meetings that he met with the opposition. This would be the leadership group of the Democratic Party. So from the very beginning, I was invited and attended all the meetings and got to know all the leaders of both parties because I attended that even though I was a brand new member. And it just, from ever after that, it kind of accelerated my career in the Senate.
When Glenn got to the legislature, he was very concerned about proper legislation for not only the community but the state. But also he had a business to run. And so what he would end up doing is, he'd leave Mankato Monday morning, drive to the cities, and he would end up staying up there until, Friday afternoon. But every evening is when the legislature was done and his legislative work was done, he was pulling out monthly reports because everybody in every company had to write a monthly report, and he was reading the monthly report, he was looking at the monthly financials, he was in communication, in that regard. Most of the Taylor employees, executives didn't go home at 5 o'clock. They were still working 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. And so he put in long days, both legislating and then balancing the time at night to be able to do that. He wasn't out going to this fundraiser or to this meal or that dinner or different things. He really had to sparse it on out to be able to do both.
The core of what he did was to bring leadership to the Minnesota Senate. And I'm not talking about Republican or Democrat leadership. I'm talking about human leadership, of getting people to work together, getting the process moving forward, seriously considering public policy, providing that. And of course, people responded. For heaven's sakes, he had been in the Senate only 2 years, and he was selected by the then minority leader, Jim Hewland, as an assistant leader, put in charge of building the staff, building the infrastructure, building the policy perspective that was necessary.
When I was elected and then asked to come aboard, and I watched the work of the staff, it appalled me that these were not people that were interested in making us stronger and better. They were, at the minimum, were satisfied with what they were So I was asked by the leadership that if I would put a new structure in place. This is where we hired people like Bob Anderson and Tommy Miracle and Greg Jackson, who still work with me after work, but also some other very good people. And when the legislature's in place, it's just like the rush at work. You have to work more than 40 hours. You have to do what's necessary. The senators are expected to be there in the evening, so the staff's got to be there. And people weren't fulfilling their duties. So I had to replace really a lot of people and bring in new people. And we brought in some outstanding, and I would call them young people. They were just young, idealistic, wanted to work hard, thought politics was one way to make the system better. And so I did make a lot of changes. Ended up getting really the support from the other senators. I mean, they saw what I did. They appreciated it. They gave me credit for it, which really, again, helped me in my step towards leadership.
2 years later, only 4 years into this service of his, he was elected leader of the entire caucus. And so he began meeting with the majority leader, with the governor, with lots of leaders throughout the state. And so I would say, number one, Glenn was a leader and brought that perspective.
Governor Perpich, who was sure a Democrat and very from the north and stuff, would sit down with me and he says, well, we both live in the rural, Glenn. What do you need for southern Minnesota and western Minnesota? I need the same thing up for northern Minnesota. And we'd find some common ground that things that would help his districts and help me. He says, okay, I'll get behind it and I'll move it into one of my bills. So I mean, even though he's a governor, he's a Democrat, he would invite me over and find out what do we have in common instead of what do we have in difference.
Glenn was really about governing. And it wasn't just about politics. This was about how do you make Minnesota a better place to live.
He was a civil leader, a leader who based his leadership on values, human relationships, I think his personal faith, and he brought that to whatever he looked at.
To him, being in the legislature was being a servant and giving back to the community and to the state.
In this section, I asked why Glenn was effective as a politician, how he stood out in this role, and why he was able to work across the aisle. Bob Anderson also shared with me specific legislation that Glenn helped pass that was the right thing to do for the Minnesota State Patrol.
I think Glenn was somewhat innocent to the ways of politics. I think he was really focused on accomplishment, focused on substance. And I think there were others in the legislature who were, but many were not. He understood power, he understood winning, he understood that you had to have votes to see legislation approved. On the other hand, that was not his sole goal. Power was a means to accomplishing good things for the community, for the region, for southern Minnesota, and for the entire state.
I think he values his reputation very highly, and I think most people that work with him respect him. And I think that's true when he was in the Senate, and he was able to work with the other party and get some things done for the betterment of the state.
Roger Moe was the leader of the Senate for the Democratic Party. But I did find out that Roger had a math degree, a teaching math degree. I also have a teaching math degree. So I looked for things that we had in common, and we talked, and so we'd spend time in meetings not talking about politics, but talking about his family, and stuff like this here. So it was just, you move from one conversation of family, jobs, history, future, and then you move into politics and you've already built a kind of a relationship just in communication. And I just found out that that worked. So even people that didn't seem to have much common with me, I was able to build relationships with them and to use that, later on. Now you say, well, how would you use that? Come on. I was egotistic enough and say to my opposition, come on, I'm a good guy. Stuff like this. I wouldn't ask for something unreasonable. And I would say stuff like this here, and they would laugh at me. They would laugh at me and say, all right, what do you little bit do you need? And that's how I'd go after little bits of bills that I need.
He was just a fantastic negotiator, because politics truly is, and governing is the art of compromise. And a component of negotiations is compromise. And I think what Glenn did better than anyone would always come back, because he did this business, how do you create a win-win? And Glenn was great at this. And he said, well, can I at least get 40% of what I want? And people would say, okay, I got 40%. And they'd feel good about that. But then he was so persistent, he'd come back the next year, and can I get 40% more?
Came to his attention that the State Patrol was under a mandate to write so many speeding tickets and so many violation tickets. And Glenn thought this was wrong. And so he moved legislation forward that stopped this practice.
Because I was a leader of the Senate, the bill got held up until the last 5 bills to be passed in the House, because they said, we're not going to pass your bill. And they assigned the opposition to a young senator who was an excellent lawyer, and I respected him greatly. But I knew him. And he took on, he says, you shouldn't be monkeying around. This is a union bill. It has to do with how people are paid. Glenn Taylor, you're a senator. You shouldn't be monkeying around with this. So we're not going to support you on it because you've just stepped your boundary. And I said, no, I understand that, but I want to share with you a story. Senator, I know your family. I know your mom has a store in Mankato, a woman's store. I know she has one in your hometown. So let's take your mom. She's working on Christmas Day, and she has a store, and she was working late. And I know the drive from Mankato to Faribault, where you live. And she's got to go kind of some country stores. I know the route. So she's going along there. It's getting close to 12 o'clock, and she gets a flat tire. And she's sitting out there on Highway 19 with this flat tire. Well, about 5 miles behind her is Highway Patrolman Bob Jones. Highway Patrolman Bob Jones only needs one more ticket to meet the next, level of for his appointment. And he knows he's got to get it done in the next half an hour. And here he comes along, and he sees there's a car on the side of the road. So he's got to make a decision. Does he pull over and help this woman, who happens to be your mother, fix that tire and give up the half an hour that he needed to find the next speeder? Or does he kind of just drive right on past and get the next speeder? I says, I don't know how you're going to vote, but I'm going to vote for Highway Patrolman stopping and helping your mom and giving up that. But I don't want him to be faced with the thing of that he might not get his promotion. So you vote how you want to vote. I'm going to vote for him. So the senators, you vote red against the bill. So they came up with about 2/3 of them voted red and 1/3 of them were green. And then the head of the Senate says, okay, we're coming to the final vote here. He hits the gavel 1, hits the gavel 2, and then before he hit the gavel 3, all the reds turned to green. And everybody voted for highway patrolmen. But I'm just saying that I think this is how you get legislation passed and stuff like this here. It was the right thing to do for the highway patrolman. It was the right thing that somebody had put something in the legislation in the past because they thought it was right. And I got a lot of bills passed that way. And all the senators voted for me in the end because it was the right thing. But you had to sell it in a way that wasn't offensive. And I had to say to the senator, you can vote however you want, but I'm, kind of voting for highway patrolman and your mom.
Glenn will definitely be remembered for his impact on education. This next segment explores that topic further, along with an example of Glenn's bold leadership style that involved the expansion of the state office building and a special election.
Education was just crucial to Glenn and for the community. Not only Minnesota State, at the time it was Mankato State University, and also the technical college. Glenn just had a special place in his heart and soul for the community and for southwestern Minnesota. So he really focused on those two. Then he also got on the Education Finance Committee, how those institutions needed to be funded. And he was very parochial, which it should be for a local state senator, but also statewide, because there was other state universities across the state. And Glenn was really instrumental on setting up a strong financial element to make those institutions grow, where it provided opportunity, for so many people across the state.
The first time I heard about Glenn Taylor was that not that he was president of Taylor Corp, but he was in the state senate. And so his impact there, not only in the local community, but statewide education, again, speaks volumes to the importance that he placed on that.
Devoted to education. So from K-12, he wanted to have certainty that there would be resources to educate our state's youth, to bring people into jobs that would allow them to stay in the state if they chose to do that, to be prepared for a variety of tasks. So a lot of support for proper funding, full funding of K-12 education. He was a great friend of vocational education, a great friend of the state universities, the community colleges, and I think that was his passion, certainly for Minnesota State Mankato. Could not have had a finer friend in the legislature, and Democrat, Republican, all acknowledge that. And certainly I think his friends at Minnesota State Mankato would.
Glenn has had a tremendous impact on higher education and all areas of education. He does really concern himself with that because he understands the value of it and how it helped him. And when he was in the Senate, he used his leverage to help K-12, to help higher ed. And he'd say to me, when I'd meet with him on a project, he'd say, now, Dick, you can't let this go. He said, we got to get one more thing out of this. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, we got to get a twofer. I said, what's a twofer? Well, we're going to get 2 buildings. We're going to get 2 projects. Let's figure out how to do it. So his political ability, his sense of how things get done were incredible. And it impacted the state of Minnesota, impacted higher ed, impacted our campus and all the thousands of students that have graduated there. It's exceptional, and without him, there's no doubt that we would not be the university we are today. And then literally thousands and thousands of students that have graduated, even in the last 20 years, it's remarkable, would not have been impacted if it had not been for him in the way that they are today.
The broader example was his ability in higher education to work across party lines. And so on the very important issue of capital funding and construction of, among other things, buildings, he was tremendously successful in getting capital improvements across the entire higher education system. It was not a matter of partisan politics. It was, what do we do for the young people of the state? what do we do to increase instructional opportunities, instructional resources, research resources. Moved without partisanship in that example. And I think we can look around Minnesota State Mankato and see many of the buildings, and even some that he's contributed personally to, but certainly what the state has made possible. The same was true for academic programs. Obviously very interested in making sure that Mankato had a very strong business school. That legacy stays with us even today. But in other areas too, educational training certainly among that, but across the reach of programming from engineering to the liberal arts, Glenn was there above, beyond, beside partisanship. Narrowly, we had an exciting time with the first reconstruction of the state office building. And Glenn had to, as leader of the minority caucus, had to make sure that we had the office space that we needed. The majority did not seem to be willing to do that. So Glenn told me, Bob, just move into 3 or 4 of the new offices and wait, and we'll see what happens. They're ours. We need that space. Very bold. No one told him to do this, not permitted. So the brother of the majority leader came by to visit Glenn and said, Glenn, what are you doing? You've got people in these offices. Glenn said, well, you know, we need this space, and so we moved in there, and we just have to take leadership, Don, Senator Donald Moe, and so I did. And he said, well, you know, Glenn, how are we going to resolve this? And Glenn said, well, you know, we have a special election coming up to replace Jim Newland, and if we win that, you know, we need more, we're going to need more space. We need to keep the space that we have, and we've got that. So let's do this, Don. If we win the election, we keep the space, and if we don't, we'll look at giving it up. Bold. We won the election. Glenn had a major part to do that, making sure we had the resources. The candidate, as a matter of fact, was a friend of many years of Glenn's friendship, and which points to another strength that he had, which was recruiting fine candidates to run for the legislature, men and women who could serve and lead. But illustrative of the personal persuasion and determination that Glenn had to make things right.
He was a unicorn, you know, at the legislature, due to the fact that his intelligence, his understanding of business, his understanding of getting good people and surrounding himself, building a good structure. But he also read the bills. And you think, well, why is that so unusual? It's very unusual. Because usually it's staff saying, well, here's the bill, and this staff person wrote this and wrote that. And Glenn actually took the time to read them. He understood them.
Glenn was nearly unique in politics. He was a businessman in a legislature that was dominated by attorneys and teachers and people from many walks of life, but not from business. Glenn was terrifically well prepared for the complex processes of politics, public policy, planning. He understood the environment in which you have to have a core goal. In business, that's profit. In politics, that's power. But he also understood people, and which was his strength. So he understood detail, planning, moving things forward with a tremendous amount of infrastructure and support. But in the end, having to get along with people. Reaching out, developing relationships, reaching across partisan lines, not so popular a perspective these days, but necessary, and he was very successful. And I would say came in, as people got to know him, he became personally more popular. Doesn't mean everyone agreed with his policies or perspective, but he left those 10 years in politics more popular with more friends, much more exposure than he ever did.
We wrap this episode of Conversations with Glenn Taylor by learning firsthand about the impact Glenn had on the life of Bob Anderson, Glenn's Chief of Staff. We also hear from Tommy Miracle and how he chose to continue working with Glenn even though he had another excellent opportunity.
Profound friend, and years can go by and we don't have a deep conversation, but he is a friend. And I'll tell you this, he, as much as anyone in my life, made a difference in my life, gave me opportunities for leadership, surely in politics, but also in business, taught me many things, focused me. And for this, I'm forever grateful, and I will tell you that. And at a personal level, one commitment that I've made, my wife knows this very well, is to thank Glenn every time I'm with him for what he's done for me and for my family and for my life. And it was life-changing to meet Glenn, to be directed by him, to be counseled by him, to be mentored by him. Didn't spend a lot of time doing it, but again, the business-like, purposeful, knowledgeable, supportive friend of Glenn Taylor. Night and day difference in my life. I thank God for that. I thank Glenn for that, and I'll never forget that.
I knew all the pluses and minuses of going to work for the senatorial committee, and what I knew with Glenn is I liked him and I trusted him, and I went with my gut, and I'm saying, I'm staying here if that's all I know what I'm going to be doing with you. And so I started working with them, and 2 years later, I got a call from the governor of Minnesota, and it was Governor Arne Carlson, and he said, Tommy, I've contacted Glenn just before we start this conversation, but would you come over to the governor's mansion, and I want to interview to have you be my chief of staff. Now, I was 29, 30 years old, was president of a company that, already, and now the governor calls you and he says, come on down to the governor's mansion and I'd like you to become my chief of staff. That's intoxicating. I mean, it really was intoxicating. You really feel like you're pretty important and pretty good. And so I went down there and had lunch with the governor at the governor's mansion, and it's just like, wow, this is as good as it gets, in that regard. So my ego was inflated. The next day, Glenn had called me and he said, say, I'm up in the city, I'd just like to know how the interview went, let's have lunch. So we had lunch, and he asked me how it went, and I told him. And, I still remember what we had for lunch. That's how memorable it was. But he said, Tommy, if you take this job, you're really good at it. The governor will be really lucky to have you, and you'll help move the state forward. I have one question for you. He said, well, I said, Glenn, what's that? And he said, what are you going to do when you're done with this job, being chief of staff? And I thought, and I said, well, I haven't thought about it. And he said, well, let me help you. He said, you're going to be looking for someone like me to give you a job that you already have today. It could be fun for a year or two, but then you're going to go out and look for a job that you already have. So I called the governor back, and I respectfully declined and stayed with Glenn, and it was by far, a really good decision on my part. But again, Glenn led me there to think of one or two steps ahead of my answer would be yes or no, of what's the next step. So that was very helpful.